Therapist, what was your "you must be kidding me" moment? Story 1. One of my clients has a habit of biting and eating his fingernails. It's gross, but not entirely unheard of. Then I found out he keeps his fingernails in a box in his room to save them for a snack later. A little grosser, but considering he's about 9, I hoped he might grow out of it. What finally made me feel nauseous was discovering that whenever anyone in his family clips their nails, fingers or toes, they give him the clippings to add to his box. This means that when he's eating nails from the box, they could belong to his mother, father, or siblings. I've already discussed this behavior with his parents, expressing concern about enabling it, but it continues. Edit. Thank you all for your concern regarding my client. I understand that it might seem like pizza or a nutritional deficiency, and it very well could be. However, as a behavioral therapist, I am not qualified to make medical recommendations to the family. I do know that his parents have taken him to several doctors for various tests to rule out disorders, so it's possible that the issue has been addressed, but the parents chose not to disclose the information to me. Story 2. I worked one summer at a school for special needs children about 2 years ago when I was 14. I was just a teacher's aide, so most of my tasks involved playing with the lower maintenance children and running errands for the teachers. One morning, I was helping the kids put their belongings into their cubbies. One of the kids just stood in front of his cubby, staring at me while holding his lunch bag. This particular student was known to be more aggressive and would react violently over small things. He was around 11 or 12 and had severe autism. I asked him if he needed help putting his stuff away, and he responded with some mumbling. I encouraged him to speak clearly, and he quietly said, "I'm going to hurt you." I was confused and asked him to repeat it. Suddenly, he screamed at the top of his lungs, "I'm going to hurt you," and swung his lunchbox straight at my head. Fortunately, I had anticipated something like this might happen, so I was ready to duck, and he missed. Since I wasn't trained to restrain students, I wasn't allowed to touch them. So until the teachers intervened, I could only run around the classroom as he chased me. After about 10 or 15 minutes, the teachers finally managed to restrain him. When asked why he acted that way, he explained that he was upset because his dad hadn't taken him to Denny's that morning. I was assaulted because a kid didn't get to go to Denny's. Story 3. I work as a speech therapist, and one of my kindergarten clients has severe behavioral issues. We are working on language and pragmatics, primarily because he tends to call people offensive names like stupid bees, little dirty W's, and goddamn disgraces, most likely to get attention. He often walks around the room calling me names like stupid B or smelly C, and will repeatedly say the word F until he's out of breath, just to see if he can provoke a reaction. I would typically focus on his articulation, as he doesn't even pronounce these words correctly. But I decided it was best to address the swearing and name-calling first before tackling pronunciation. Story 4. I provided therapeutic counseling and rehabilitation services for individuals with brain injuries. During a family conference, I was trying to explain to the family that they needed to accept their son brother as he was in the present moment, since he wasn't likely to improve much further. Unfortunately, the family was being unkind, calling him stupid, and generally offering the worst kind of support imaginable. The family insisted they would never accept him in his current state and demanded that I arrange a brain transplant so he could go back to how he was before the accident. I managed to keep a straight face, but my student couldn't hold back her laughter and had to leave the room. The family was furious and demanded to know why she had laughed at them. I had to calmly explain that first, brain transplants are not possible, and second, even if they were, it would mean putting someone else's brain into their son's body, essentially a different person altogether. They couldn't understand this and kept insisting that I was just being lazy and unwilling to do my job. I felt incredibly sorry for that young man. Story 5. I have a master's degree in clinical psychology and am currently working towards my doctorate. I couldn't help but laugh when I read this question because I feel like I encounter at least one of these moments daily during my clinic rotations, regardless of the setting. One of the most memorable experiences happened while I was working at a camp for children with various psychological disorders, most of whom had behavioral issues. I was paired with a young girl who had a history of aggressive and violent tendencies. Surprisingly, we managed to get through the entire day without any incidents, until we started a group physical activity to wind down and focus before leaving for the day. The problem arose when the girl realized she couldn't continue playing with a particular toy during the activity. Frustrated, she took off her shoe and threw it at a little boy in front of her. The boy, who had autism, immediately started crying and screaming. While someone attended to him, I turned to the girl to calmly explain that what she did was wrong. As I turned, she suddenly punched me square in the face and then grabbed a handful of my hair, managing to pull out a decent chunk. I'm about 5 feet 1 inch, and this girl was maybe 1 or 2 inches shorter, but had about 20 pounds on me, despite being just 9 years old. Trying to apply a safe physical restraint was both challenging and a bit comical. Eventually, with help from other staff, we managed to calm her down after about 15 minutes. The most frustrating part came when we explained the situation to her mother. She completely dismissed the incident and even laughed about it, clearly reinforcing this kind of behavior at home. The girl then started hitting her mother, who restrained her arms. The girl looked at me and the other staff member and sarcastically asked, "Ugh, a little help over here? Are you going to let her do this to me? She's hurting my arm." That night I went home and had this strange laugh Sean cry moment for a few hours. Thankfully, you learn not to take things personally pretty quickly in this field. So by the next day, I was back to normal. Looking back, I'm still baffled at how rapidly the situation escalated. Most other memorable moments involve poop in some capacity. Story 6. I had a client, an older female refugee, whom I worked with for several months before she finally confided that she had a court date the following week. She was worried because she might be deported if found guilty. She hadn't mentioned it earlier due to shame and had been suffering in silence. She was living with extended family members who got busted for smuggling and selling cat, a stimulant narcotic. The family decided that she would take the blame for her husband and sons, who were the ones actually involved. At the time of the arrest, the police brought in an interpreter who spoke a completely different language from a different ethnic group and country than the client. Even worse, there was no interpreter present during the initial questioning at the station, and she had to wait nearly 2 days before they finally found someone who spoke her language. I asked her if she understood the situation, and she told me that her lawyer, a public defender whom she had met only once, had said she would be deported. Beyond that, she had no idea what was happening or how the process worked. I had previously seen her psychological evaluation, which indicated that she had the cognitive abilities of a 7-year-old. I told her that we had information that could help her case and that her lawyer needed to see it as soon as possible. This was on a Friday and court was scheduled for Wednesday. Unfortunately, the client didn't know the lawyer's name or any other contact information. We managed to get a friend to help gather the necessary documents, and the client brought them to me on Monday. After signing the release of information (ROI), the lawyer called me back that afternoon, saying they had no useful information for the case, despite it seeming like a clear setup. I explained that we had a lot of relevant insight, data, and records that could potentially get the charges dropped. Since I didn't work on Tuesdays, I spent the whole day worrying and hoping that the information would reach the right people in time. On Wednesday, I finally got the news from court. All charges were dropped. I often found myself in situations like this, having important details sprung on me at the last minute and needing to navigate bureaucratic hurdles to alter the outcome of high-stakes situations. I wrote countless letters. Though I was hired as a mental health provider, I ended up doing a significant amount of case management simply because no one else would take on that responsibility. Story 7. I work in a community residence for adults with mental illness. Most of them are quite capable and independent. One woman, who is 27 years old, often acts in a deliberately foolish way to gain sympathy and will do irrational things just because she can. When she was first admitted, she tripped while getting out of bed. She's about 5 feet 1 inch and 200 pounds, and fell on her foot, breaking some of the small bones. I took her to get a cast, and the usual instructions were given. Don't get the cast wet, use crutches, elevate the foot, etc. Since her room was on the second floor, we had to send her back to her mother's house temporarily, as she wouldn't be able to exit the building safely in an emergency. 5 days later, the protective shoe-wash boot that goes over the cast arrived. We called her to let her know we'd bring it over, and her response was, "Well, I don't think it'll fit." We asked why, and she replied, "Because I cut my cast off. I got it wet, and it was too tight." She didn't get a second cast, and she never used her crutches, claiming they were unstable and that she would fall if she tried. As a result, her foot never healed properly, and about 2 months later, she fell and broke it again. Edit. To clarify some points, she didn't get a second cast because she would have had to pay for it herself and she didn't have the money. The doctors didn't want to give her another plaster cast, fearing she would just cut that off too. Other casting options weren't covered by insurance. Yes, being 5 feet 1 inch and 200 pounds is considered significantly overweight. Many people with mental health issues come from low-income backgrounds and often struggle with weight due to poor health care, lack of knowledge about weight loss, and inability to afford healthy food. I can tell she acts unintentionally foolish for attention because when she thinks no one is watching, she behaves normally and makes reasonable decisions. Plus, she has admitted that she believes acting dumb makes guys like her more and earns her sympathy. Story 8. I was running an addiction treatment group where some of the participants were court-referred, usually for DUI offenses. The deal was simple. If they completed the treatment, they wouldn't have to serve jail time for the DUI. One of these court-referred participants ran a limo service and came to the group with a tablet and cell phone, spreading his stuff out like it was his personal office. I approached him, explaining that he couldn't conduct business during group sessions. He shot me a look that could kill and said it was a busy time of year and he needed to keep in touch with his drivers. I acknowledged his situation but reiterated that he needed to put the devices away and focus on the session. After some eye-rolling and muttering, "I can't believe this lady," he continued checking his phone and stepping outside to take calls. During the break, I told him that his behavior was disruptive and that he would have to leave. He seemed pleased, until I added that I would inform the judge that he hadn't completed the treatment. That was when it dawned on him that his behavior might actually land him in jail. He apologized and asked to stay. After that, he managed to pay attention without further interruptions. Story 9. I once had a patient who engaged in self-injurious behavior by swallowing metal and pointy objects, usually as a way to get into or stay in the hospital. At one point, they wanted surgeries or procedures to remove the objects, but weren't actually suicidal. There was one particularly serious incident where they nearly died after ingesting several closed safety pins that opened inside their stomach. That close call made them stop swallowing objects that wouldn't naturally pass through. One day, this patient was upset about being discharged because they wanted to stay until the beginning of the month, likely because they were out of benefits. Their usual claims of being suicidal weren't working since we knew they weren't genuinely suicidal. So they decided to swallow the iron piece from a Monopoly game. It didn't work. We still discharged them. However, from that point on, board games were only allowed under staff supervision on the unit. Story 10. I'm a foster parent who temporarily houses kids. One morning I went to use the bathroom and immediately noticed a pungent smell. I searched everywhere, but couldn't find the source, until I looked in the towel closet. There were small scraps of toilet paper that looked normal but smelled terrible, so I threw them out. This happened every day for about 2 weeks, and I couldn't figure out what was going on. One night, I heard the foster kid using the bathroom late, which was unusual. After he went back to his room, I went in to check, and the strong smell of feces hit me. I opened the towel closet and sure enough, found pieces of poo wrapped in toilet paper. I was shocked and didn't understand why they were there. The next morning, I checked the bathroom again while he was getting ready for school and noticed his backpack lying there. Curious, I opened it and found a slightly moist t-shirt wrapped around a collection of feces. I was stunned and called the boy upstairs. After searching for him, I found him in his room, pulling out kitchen paper towels from under his bed, each with a piece of poo on them. I asked him what he was doing and he replied, "Paper towels don't stick to it and tear off." I then asked him about the backpack and he said, "I don't want it to dry out or get too mushy, so I use the shirt with a little water." I was at a loss for words. He wouldn't explain why he was doing it and refused to discuss it further. I ended up locking the towel closet because he kept storing feces there. After that, he started hiding them under his bed. He's no longer allowed to have a backpack because he kept restarting his collection and taking it to school with him. It's overwhelming, and I still don't know how to handle this situation properly. Story 11. I'm not a therapist, but this was definitely a WTF moment. I once had to attend a school counseling session. It all started because the fire alarm in the building went off 3 times that night. The first time was a drill, the second time was around dinner, and the third time was at around 3 in the morning. By the last alarm, I snapped, and in frustration, threatened the kid who triggered it with a baseball bat. You know, one of those stupid indoor fire alarms. Because of this antisocial behavior, I was sent to one session of counseling. It was a group session, and while we were there, the counselor asked one of the guys why he was attending. He casually replied that he was there because his roommate caught him having S with a warmed-up shepherd's pie in the kitchen, and it wasn't even his own pie. Everyone in the room just froze and stared at him. He wasn't embarrassed or anything. He just calmly admitted to having intercourse with his roommate's shepherd's pie. Story 12. The scariest experience of my life was when my best friend had a mental breakdown. He became convinced that he had died and that all his friends and family were just beings mimicking his loved ones, making it impossible for him to trust us. He started reflecting on every mistake he had made, both big and small, and became convinced that he was destined for hell after being stuck in a purgatory that resembled his old life. It was terrifying to look into the eyes of someone I'd known for over a decade and realize he didn't recognize me anymore. I didn't know how to handle it. Should I try to meet him halfway, acknowledging the possibility that he had died while pointing out that his goals and relationships still existed in this reality? Or should I completely shut down his delusions, risking that he might push me away? My biggest fear was that he might try to test his theory by hurting himself, believing that dying again would somehow prove something. He fell into a depression, believing that in the real world, where he thought he had died, his friends and family were suffering his loss. He became obsessed with analyzing his past behaviors, convinced that he had hurt people far more than he actually had. At one point, he started referring to me in the third person, saying I wasn't his real best friend anymore. He constantly begged me to recall a time when he made me happy. I tried sharing stories about gifts, shared jokes, trips, and moments when he had been supportive, but none of it convinced him. He would find reasons to twist my words, insisting that even those good memories were examples of his selfishness or manipulation. It was heartbreaking to watch him pick himself apart like that, convinced that our entire friendship was a lie. I visited him in the psych ward every day. Some days he was himself again, clear-eyed and rational, and he could process what had happened. But on other days he would be angry, accusing me of tricking him and claiming I was the devil in disguise. I never knew who I would be talking to on any given day, my best friend or someone completely different. Mental illness is such a brutal battle because it's not like a physical wound that you can visibly see healing. You never know when a setback is just a small step back or a complete regression. I kept hoping for stability, but every time he slipped back into his delusions, it felt like we were moving further away from recovery. Story 13. I'm not a therapist, but I used to see one for severe anxiety issues. I had been seeing her for a while, and my condition was slowly improving. No longer hyperventilating during day-to-day activities was a huge win for me. About a year ago, we arranged to meet at a nearby coffee shop because her office was being renovated. During the meeting, we did the usual check-in. I shared my weekly chart where I noted what triggered my anxiety. She gave me some pointers on cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, but I often forgot those techniques and would still panic in many situations. Then the conversation took a strange turn. We started discussing my past, even though I had only been seeing her for about a month. I opened up about being sexually harassed by a teacher when I was young, and how, when I told my parents, they did nothing about it. On top of that, I shared how my father was an alcoholic who would beat me and my mom. As I spoke, I noticed that she was staring at the floor, clenching her hands and digging her nails into her palms. After a few minutes, I suddenly heard sobbing and realized she was crying. Completely frozen, I had no idea what to do. Then she explained that she once had a baby brother who died when he was around my age, 20. Growing up, her brother often protected her from their abusive father, and one day, while trying to shield her, he was strangled to death. Everyone in the cafe was staring at us, including the staff, and I could hear people whispering, assuming I was breaking up with her. My anxiety went into overdrive, and I started stuttering, trying to apologize while she buried her head in her arms and continued crying. I paid for the coffee, suggested we leave, and even paid for the lift. A few days later, she called to apologize and said she would refer me to a colleague. I thanked her, wished her well, and tried to process what had happened while sipping on a strawberry milkshake, wondering if it was some kind of test. Story 14. I work in a therapy clinic, though I'm not a therapist. Yesterday, one of the therapy sessions was abruptly cut short because a 9-year-old boy had cornered a therapist and was hitting her with the plug end of a laptop charger. The therapist in question was my mother, which made the situation even more stressful. Thankfully, the kid's parent and I managed to intervene and restrain him, but not before he had left my mom with several bruises. Another time, a child was brought in to be assessed for autism. He clearly didn't want to be there and started acting out, throwing little kid chairs around the room. It wasn't too chaotic until he spotted the container of Lego blocks. He looked at the Lego box, then at me, with a mischievous grin, and deliberately tipped the entire container onto the floor. I spent the next 30 minutes on my hands and knees picking up countless Lego pieces. Story 15. A teenager came to a session and casually admitted that they had broken into their neighbor's house just for fun by smashing a window. They said they browsed the CD collection and were disappointed by all the Spanish music. While exploring the house for money, they suddenly heard the shower running upstairs. Someone was home. Panicked, they ran out of the house and, in an odd twist, decided to bake a lemon meringue pie. They returned to the neighbor's house to give it as a gift, but no one answered the door. I discussed the situation with the teen and concluded that a mental health evaluation might be necessary. After calling the police, I allowed the teen to use the restroom. However, they took the opportunity to bolt from the office. The police eventually found them at their parents' workplace, asking for $20. The teen was subsequently hospitalized in a psych ward for a month. Story 16. I'm a psychology student, not yet a therapist. I know of a person who was diagnosed with schizophrenia at around 9 years old. His behavior became increasingly erratic through his teens and early 20s, and he began abusing substances, likely as a result of his condition. One night, the police caught him riding a pedal bike down the street at 3 a.m., wearing a mask and carrying about 3 pounds of crystal meth. Since his father knew the judge, he was sent to a mental institution rather than facing criminal charges. During his evaluation, he told the doctors that he was selling sugar for God, but then explained that God is just a facade for the devil. The devil is God. A week into his stay, he mutilated his genitalia with broken light bulbs and bed springs. When asked why, he said that a giant floating eyeball was following him and speaking with the devil's voice. The eye had instructed him to remove the impurities from his body. Story 17. I'm not a therapist, but I had a surprising experience with mine during college. I grew up in poverty with parents who struggled with addiction and abuse, and I'd been through a lot. Despite everything, I thought I was handling life fairly well. During college, I came out as gay to a few friends, and soon the whole campus knew. Feeling overwhelmed, I discussed it with my therapist, hoping for guidance. Instead, she asked if I would be willing to act as a mentor or big gay brother to another student who had just come out. I was shocked. At a time when I was struggling to navigate my own feelings and identity, she wanted me to be a support system for someone else. I couldn't believe it. I still feel guilty sometimes, worrying that the other student might have gone back into the closet because I couldn't be that rock for him. Story 18. A couple of years ago, for my 19th birthday, I decided to go to New Orleans. And, not the smartest decision, I went to Bourbon Street to drink despite being underage. I managed to get one of those iconic sugary drinks served in a plastic cup shaped like a hand grenade. Feeling pretty pleased with myself, I wandered down Bourbon Street, drink in hand. Of course, I looked young, and a cop pulled me aside, hitting me with a minor in possession (MIP) charge. Fortunately, when I got back home, I realized I'd gotten off pretty easy. The judge didn't take it too seriously. Apparently, in New Orleans, they care less about minors drinking than the cops do. I didn't get a record, just a minimal fine. When I was telling my therapist about it, I mentioned that I got caught with a hand grenade on Bourbon. He gave me this incredulous look and asked in a very calm but slightly bewildered tone, "You said you had a hand grenade? How did you come into possession of that?" That's when I realized I hadn't clarified that I was talking about the drink and not an actual explosive. My therapist had been sitting there, trying to process how I managed to get my hands on a real grenade and why I wasn't in prison. Story 19. I'm studying to become a therapist, and one day in class, we had a guest speaker who works as a therapist come to share some of his experiences. Naturally, we were curious about his scariest clients, especially those who posed a danger to themselves or others. He explained the challenge of maintaining confidentiality while also fulfilling the duty to warn when necessary. The first story he shared was about a client who seemed like a normal young woman. He had been seeing her regularly and hadn't noticed any major red flags. After one of their sessions, he went home as usual. A few days later, while watching the news with his wife, he saw his client's face on the screen. She had been murdered. He couldn't discuss it with anyone, not even his wife, because of confidentiality. He emphasized how being a therapist can mean many sleepless nights, haunted by things you couldn't see coming. The second story was about a client he openly described as a psychopath or sociopath, someone with no empathy or regard for others. The client came in for a session and casually chatted about his week and his troubled marriage. Then, in a disturbingly nonchalant way, he mentioned that he had raped his wife the previous night because she wanted a divorce, and he wanted her one last time before she left. The therapist managed to remain composed during the session, but was panicking internally. Later, he quietly suggested to the wife that she seek help, but she never returned to the sessions, so he never knew what became of her. The guest speaker also shared another incident where a client openly discussed plans to murder someone they knew. In that case, the therapist was legally required to break confidentiality and call the police to warn the intended victim. He said it's one of the hardest parts of the job, deciding when to break confidentiality to protect someone's life. Story 20. I've worked at a special needs school for almost 2 years now, and I've seen some pretty shocking things. Here are a few of my experiences and stories from my coworkers. In my first year, I was assigned to a classroom with all boys aged 6 to 8. They all had multiple disabilities and were mostly nonverbal. Luckily, our classroom had a bathroom, which was convenient because 2 of the boys needed supervision while using it. One boy, whom I'll call John, was generally good at using the bathroom independently. One day before lunch, I reminded him to go. After about a minute, I peeked in to check on him and found him completely naked, bent over so that his backside faced the full-length mirror. He had his finger shoved right up his butt and was smiling dreamily. Our school takes students up to age 21, as is typical in special education. One high school class in particular housed some of the more aggressive students. I once saw a 15-year-old boy bite and claw chunks out of his own arm, leaving scars all over. He had Fragile X syndrome, which can cause severe self-harm. There was a period when he needed to be restrained almost every day by the male teacher and 2 aides, sometimes for 20 minutes at a time. Another student in the same class had severe mental issues, though I'm not entirely sure of his diagnosis. He lived in a group home because his family couldn't manage him. This kid would get in your face and threaten to slit your throat or rape your family while smiling. His verbal abuse was disturbingly consistent. One day he became aggressive and needed to be restrained. Due to the situation, they had to perform a hold on the hallway floor, but without the usual head support. During the restraint, he started slamming his head against the tiled floor, leaving blood everywhere while laughing hysterically. I have countless stories like these. It's a never-ending cycle of challenging behavior and unpredictable incidents. Story 21. I used to work as an aide at a facility that offered a second chance for children and adults who had been kicked out of state-funded programs. These were people with severe, low-functioning behavioral disorders, combined with other conditions, making it a risky job. Most of my shifts were overnight, usually working alone. But one night, there were 2 of us on duty. The house had 3 kids, a 16-year-old who was close to being released, a 9-year-old and a 12-year-old who had been getting up around 2 a.m. and wandering the house. That night, we heard the door alarm go off, indicating that the 12-year-old was up again. We found him in the kitchen, eating a block of cheddar cheese straight from the fridge, just taking big bites and complaining about being hungry. We blocked him from going upstairs to disturb the others, and eventually got him to give us the partially eaten cheese. Later, we discovered he had toys in his room, which was against the rules. He threw them at us one by one as we collected them. Suddenly, he tried to escape through the window, but we caught him and brought him back inside. He threw a tantrum, urinated on his bed, and then tried to run past us to the living room. Due to company policies, we couldn't physically restrain him, so we had to follow and try to de-escalate verbally. He started trashing the living room, trying to tear apart the Xbox. I ended up blocking him into a corner with my body to keep him from causing more damage. In retaliation, he bit me, spit on me, swore at me, and punched me full force in the throat. We ended up performing a wall hold, essentially keeping him safely against the wall while taking breaks to ensure his and our safety. This went on for 3 hours. Unfortunately, that wasn't the first or last time something like that happened. After so many incidents, I developed a strong anxiety reaction to the sound of children screaming, even when it's just playful noise. It's a lasting impact from those intense nights. Story 22. My job requires all employees to go through a weapons qualification course, which includes a range shoot day, as we all carry firearms at work. Some of those range days have made me genuinely say, "You've got to be kidding me." During one of the courses, an employee from another department got kicked out for inappropriate behavior. We used dummy guns during training to practice reloads and hip draw techniques. This guy thought it would be funny to take the dummy gun and fake rob his classmates while on the range. Needless to say, the instructors didn't find it amusing, and he was promptly kicked out. Another incident involved an employee who, after completing a live fire drill, decided to twirl his gun cowboy style, like in old Western movies. He, too, was kicked off the range and never got to requalify. The guy who was fake robbing people was recently fired for embezzlement. Seems like his questionable judgment extended beyond just the range. Story 23. This isn't a personal experience, but more of an observation on how people perceive certain religious groups. Sometimes people mistake non-mainstream Christian groups for being entirely separate from Christianity, which isn't necessarily accurate. There are some groups that, instead of branching off from another church, believe they are continuing the original church that Jesus established on earth. Because of this belief, they don't follow the Nicene Creed or other mainstream Christian practices. However, that doesn't mean they aren't Christian. They just have a different way of interpreting and practicing the faith. It's essential to understand that religion isn't just about theological definitions. It's something that needs to be felt and experienced. Christianity, in particular, goes beyond being just a list of beliefs. It's a moral code, a way of life, and often a central part of a person's identity. When studying non-mainstream Christian religions, you might find many that don't fit the traditional formula, but still consider themselves Christian. It's likely that a broader understanding of Christianity would better encompass these groups rather than dismissing them outright. Story 24. I once had a 15-year-old client diagnosed with anxiety and depression. He refused to take any medication for it, which made managing his symptoms more challenging. His grandmother came from India to stay with him, and together they started practicing meditation. When I first saw him 2 weeks after his grandmother arrived, he was in a terrible state, barely eating, having frequent panic attacks, and still adamant about not taking any medication. While I helped him with some cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, it was clear that meditation was the real game changer for him. Over the next 6 weeks, I saw a transformation. Slowly but surely, he started engaging with life again. He showed interest in activities, his eyes regained their spark, and he even started laughing during our sessions. His mother was thrilled, saying she hadn't seen him like that in over a year. I had always been skeptical about meditation's ability to help with anxiety and depression, but witnessing his progress firsthand completely changed my perspective. It was remarkable to see how powerful and effective meditation can be. Story 25. I'm a client, not a therapist, but I want to share an experience that impacted both me and my psychologist. The first time I saw my psychologist was after a suicide attempt. She helped me through it, and I later learned that, although she had worked with many suicidal clients, I was the first one she saw who had actually attempted it, successful or not. She never mentioned this to me at the time, as she shouldn't, but I came to realize that she didn't fully understand why I would take such drastic measures given my situation. I'm sure many people would feel the same way, thinking I didn't have a good enough reason. A while later, when the series 13 Reasons Why came out, a lot of people criticized the main character, Hannah, saying she had no reason to kill herself and had plenty of other options. The suicide scene brought up a lot of negative emotions for many of my psychologist clients, including triggering a severe PTSD reaction in me. The show became a frequent topic in her sessions. At one point, she asked a client if they thought Hannah had a good reason to end her life. The client responded, "I don't think it matters what I think. It was still good enough for Hannah." That response stuck with her. Later, she apologized to me for not fully understanding my mindset back when I first came to see her. It didn't bother me. It had been over a year, and she still helped me climb out of that dark place, even without completely understanding. She kept her personal biases out of our sessions, and she's the reason I'm still here today. People often debate whether someone's reason for suicide is good enough, but they miss the point. Those reasons only have to be good enough for one person, the one experiencing them. Story 26. I worked with a male adolescent whose mother had a troubled past. She was a former prostitute and stripper, and her previous substance abuse had severely affected her short-term memory. This limitation made it frustrating to see her as a competent caregiver for her son. As a young counselor at the time, I realized in hindsight that I had developed a rigid and judgmental view of her. One day, the mother mentioned that she had kept journals while she was pregnant with her son and asked if I wanted to read them. Curious, I agreed. When she brought the journals to a session, I started reading. What I discovered was nothing short of life-changing. The journals, written about 14 years earlier, were filled with her daily struggles, hopes, dreams, routines, and above all, her aspirations for her unborn son. As I read through them, I felt a deep sense of shame. I realized that the image I had constructed of her, a drug-addicted stripper prostitute, was unfair and lacked understanding. The depth and honesty of her writings shattered my preconceived notions. That experience fundamentally changed how I approach my clients and their families. It also made me reflect on my own life and how I tend to judge people without fully understanding their stories. Story 27. I'm a therapist, and there's something important I want people to know. Therapists do think about their clients outside of sessions. It might be when preparing for the next meeting, while watching a TV show the client mentioned, or just in passing when something reminds us of them. Even after clients leave, I often find myself wondering how they're doing, especially when reflecting on past work. One of the first lessons we learn in training is to maintain professional boundaries, which usually means sharing as little about ourselves as possible. However, I've found that casual, honest disclosures can make a significant difference. For example, I've chosen to casually mention that I'm queer or gay to some clients who I knew or suspected were also part of the LGBTQ+ community. Seeing the positive shift in our dynamic afterward has been amazing. Sometimes it's something simple. A client might ask if I watch Game of Thrones, and I'd reply, "No, but my wife loves it." I've also mentioned taking mental health medication when relevant. I've learned not to underestimate how powerful it can be for someone to know that their therapist shares similar struggles or experiences. A saying I've adopted is, "Move the rock, not the mountain." Small, gradual progress is more sustainable than trying to tackle everything at once. It's a lesson I teach my clients and remind myself of often. Story 28. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist, and much of my work with clients revolves around helping them learn how not to judge themselves too harshly. It's a fundamental part of therapy, guiding people to evaluate their worth without being overly critical. One of the most striking realizations I've had in my career is just how pervasive self-judgment is. No matter how accomplished or resilient a person might be, they often have a remarkable ability to judge themselves harshly, much more than others would. I'm frequently taken aback by how people fail to recognize their own strengths and achievements, while being excessively unkind to themselves. My role is to help clients see themselves with compassion and to teach them to treat themselves as they would treat a loved one. It's a straightforward concept, but it's not an easy practice. I love working on this aspect of therapy because seeing people gradually shift from self-criticism to self-kindness is incredibly rewarding. Judgment itself is a simple process. It's labeling a person, idea, or object as good or bad. We do it all the time, and the real issue arises when we start believing those judgments as absolute truth. In therapy, I help people recognize these judgments as just thoughts, not necessarily facts, and encourage them to challenge or let go of them. Developing this skill is a lifelong journey, but it's one of the most valuable ones. Story 29. When I was a teenager, I lived in a household that was both emotionally and mentally abusive. Many people don't take that kind of abuse seriously, but it affected me so deeply that I was later diagnosed with PTSD by a psychiatrist. One day, while we were in the car, my abusive parents and I got into a heated argument. My stepdad abruptly stopped the car on the highway and told me to get out, saying they were going to leave me there. I wasn't scared because I knew I could call the police and report being abandoned, which would get them into serious trouble. So I calmly said, "Sounds good," and got out of the car. That's when my mom came out and started attacking me. After the assault, I refused to get back in the car. My stepdad then got out, dragged me by the hair, called me a bipolar B, and forced me back into the vehicle. Later, they forced me to see a therapist and lied about what happened. They told the therapist that I had jumped out of a moving car and then attacked my mom when she tried to help me. The therapist didn't believe my side of the story and insisted that I take bipolar medication. I knew I wasn't bipolar. I was just reacting to years of abuse, and my feelings of anger and sadness were completely justified. At one point, the therapist glared at me and said, "You're not nearly as smart as you think you are." After that, I completely shut down. I would just sit in the sessions in silence while she made snarky, sarcastic remarks before dismissing me. It was clear that she wasn't there to help me. She was only reinforcing my parents' narrative. When I turned 18, I moved out on my own, put myself through college without any financial help from my family, and eventually left the country to put as much distance as possible between us. I'm now on antidepressants for my PTSD, and thankfully, the therapists I've had as an adult have been nothing like that terrible woman. But even now, thinking about that experience still deeply upsets me. Story 30. I'm not a licensed therapist, but I am a behavioral health technician, which means I have a psychology degree and was trained in behavioral intervention techniques for children. My role often involved coaching parents to support their children with behavior disorders. One thing that became abundantly clear to me was that most of the children I worked with didn't seem to have clear mental illnesses in the way that adults with serious mental illness do. Instead, they often appeared confused or lonely, and many of their struggles were linked to the harsh realities of poverty. If their families had access to affordable childcare and livable wages, I genuinely believe that many of these kids would not exhibit such severe symptoms. In that sense, advocating for better socioeconomic support is inherently mental health advocacy. I found myself not judging the children, but rather their parents. Some would drop off their kids and leave with a fix my kid attitude without participating or showing any willingness to learn. As a parent myself now, I understand that exhaustion and burnout are real, but at the time I couldn't help but feel frustrated. My goal in those situations was to give the child an hour-long glimpse of what a loving, structured environment looks like. Sadly, those were the kids I knew would likely end up stuck in cycles of institutionalization, homelessness, or even prison. On the other hand, when a parent would stay, ask questions, and genuinely want to know how to help their child, I would practically jump for joy. Those kids I knew stood a better chance because they had someone in their corner fighting for them. Story 31. I'm not a therapist, but I became a patient after my mom passed away. I needed help processing the grief and trauma from both her death and my childhood, where I faced abandonment by both parents and severe neglect and abuse from caregivers. During one session, I was discussing these traumatic experiences, and when I looked up, I noticed my therapist had put down her notepad. She was staring at me wide-eyed, and for a moment, I thought she was going to tell me I was crazy. There was an uncomfortable silence, and then she said, "You need to realize how special you are. You did it. You could have been a statistic, but you beat the odds. Can we dig deeper into your childhood? I want to understand what you were thinking at the time because it might help me with other patients." That moment changed my perspective entirely. I had always thought of myself as broken, but she helped me see that surviving those experiences was remarkable. We worked together for 8 months using cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, focusing on my triggers and attachment issues. She helped me realize that, despite everything, I was not just surviving but overcoming. That therapist didn't just help me heal, she made me feel valued, showing me that my past could actually help others. I will always be grateful to her for that. Story 32. I'm not a therapist, but I had a really unsettling experience with a friend recently. We hadn't seen each other for about 8 months, and when we finally hung out, she seemed completely different, paranoid and constantly taking photos of random people. She would take selfies while trying to inconspicuously capture people in the background. It was so obvious that I finally asked her what was going on. She hesitated and said I wouldn't believe her, but I assured her I would listen. She then explained that her boyfriend was the leader of an underground secret society, like the Illuminati, and that he was manufacturing a drug that didn't show up on any tests. She believed he was using this drug to rape her and sell her body to random people. She was convinced that the strangers around us knew her boyfriend and would report back to him. I was shaken. I honestly thought she was having a psychotic break or maybe suffering from schizophrenia. Later that night, I found out she had gone to the ER because she was suicidal. I picked up her mom since she took the only car, and we drove to the hospital. Due to COVID restrictions, we couldn't go in, but we managed to confirm she was there and spoke with the nurse who was preparing to do a psych evaluation. The nurse asked if we had any concerns or if she had a history of mental illness. Her mom just said, "Yeah, just suicidal." I tried to explain what my friend had told me, but her mom flipped out and accused me of ruining their vacation plans. Apparently, they had tickets to Florida in 3 days, and she was more upset about that than about her daughter's mental state. My friend ended up being admitted to a psychiatric hospital, and I haven't spoken to her or her mom since. Honestly, I don't regret telling the nurse the truth. Her mom can hate me all she wants, but my friend needed help. I just hope she's doing better now. Story 33. I'm a licensed psychologist, and as many others in the field have noted, judgment really isn't part of the job, at least not if you've had proper training and done the necessary internal work on yourself. However, not all therapists have done that, so if you don't feel a good connection with your therapist, don't hesitate to find a better fit. I often explain to my clients that I see myself as the navigator while they are the captain of their own ship. I've been brought on board to help chart a course from where they are to where they want to go. I know a lot about the waters and the landscape, psychology, human behavior, habits, but they are the experts on the boat and crew, themselves, their lives, and their important relationships. I don't expect clients to take every piece of advice I give because they know things I don't. My job is to help adjust the course when obstacles arise, not to dictate how they should live their lives. It's their boat, after all. That said, I'm also honest when I notice patterns. If I've suggested 20 tools or strategies and they don't use any of them, but then come in saying we're just sailing in circles, that's a different conversation. I'll respectfully point out that it seems like we're stuck, and I'll try to understand what's getting in the way. Even then, it's not about judging their choices, just acknowledging the pattern and exploring why it might be happening. It's a balance of guiding without controlling and respecting the client's autonomy while also being honest about when things aren't progressing. Story 34. I'm a licensed art therapist, and something important to understand is that therapists are trained to approach therapy without judgment. We have to be mindful of two concepts in particular: transference and countertransference. Transference is when a client redirects their feelings about a specific person onto someone else. In therapy, this often means projecting feelings about someone from their life onto the therapist. Countertransference is when a therapist redirects their own feelings toward the client, often based on their own unresolved issues or emotional reactions. That said, even with training, I've definitely experienced strong and visceral countertransference toward clients. For instance, I've worked with clients who hold very different political beliefs from mine, clients who think the pandemic is a hoax, and even clients who have a history of being abusive. If I were having casual conversations outside of therapy, I would likely judge some of these perspectives. But within the therapy space, it's different. I remind myself that the person sitting in front of me is human, vulnerable, and looking for help to work through their internal struggles. They are allowing themselves to be seen and heard, and my role is to support them through that, not judge them. The key is to keep the focus on their humanity and their willingness to confront difficult parts of themselves. Regardless of my personal feelings, I stay committed to creating a safe and non-judgmental space for them to explore their challenges. Story 35. I'm a registered psychologist, and one important aspect of our training is reflecting on our own biases, moral compass, and professional ethics daily. During my oral ethics exam, one of the key questions was about judgment, how we handle it, and how we recognize our own biases. You can't just say, I would never judge anyone. I accept every single person. That's not a realistic answer because at the end of the day, we're human too. We have feelings, emotional responses, and personal values. The point is not to pretend that we are immune to judgment, but to be aware of where our biases lie. My honest answer during the exam was that I would struggle to work with someone who willingly and purposefully tortures and kills animals for pleasure. I admitted that it would be difficult for me not to pass judgment on an animal abuser. To my relief, the panel accepted this answer as the correct one because they expect psychologists to identify populations they may find challenging to work with. Recognizing our own limitations helps ensure that we provide competent and unbiased care to those we can genuinely support. Story 36. As a student, I had a professor who practiced forensic psychology. One day in class, he shared a story that still horrifies me. He was working with a family where the first child had committed suicide. The parents were being evaluated along with their second child after the tragedy. What shocked me was how indifferent the parents were. They hadn't acknowledged their first child's struggles with depression or any of the underlying issues that led to the suicide. After the death, they remained completely detached, refusing to see how their lack of care might have contributed. It didn't stop there. They continued ignoring their second child, who was also developing serious mental health problems. Eventually, the second child also took their own life. Even then, the parents showed no sign of remorse or self-reflection. They still didn't see how their neglect might have played a role. After the second SUIC, they actually told the therapist they were considering having another child, without showing any intention of changing their indifferent attitude. It was like they couldn't comprehend the damage their lack of empathy was causing. Story 37. I'm not a therapist, but I was a patient once. A few years after a car accident that left me in chronic, excruciating pain, I reached a breaking point. No treatment seemed to help, and the doctors wouldn't even prescribe pain medication despite how much I was suffering. I was ready to end my life, but I met with a psychologist as a last resort because I didn't want to hurt my mom with my death. I opened up about how the pain was unbearable, and that suicide felt like my only option. The psychologist listened and then bluntly told me to do it. He said I should stop bitching about it and just go through with it if that's what I wanted. He dismissed my pain, accused me of just seeking attention, and told me to either stop whining or kill myself. His words pushed me over the edge. I went home, put a rope over the rafters, tied the other end around my neck, and kicked the stool out from under me. I was losing consciousness when my stepdad came home early, got me down, and called an ambulance. I survived, but the damage was done. When the hospital staff asked why I tried to kill myself, I told them everything the psychologist had said. They were outraged and reported him. Later, I found out that he justified his actions by claiming he was using reverse psychology to make me realize I didn't actually want to die. He said he had miscalculated how serious I was about the attempt, and they believed him. He faced no consequences, no reprimand, nothing. That day, I lost all faith in the system. It broke me to know that someone who was supposed to help me actually pushed me closer to the edge, and the system let him get away with it. Story 38. I'm a therapist, and this happened early in my career when I worked at a recovery center for families. One family we worked with had a mother who had been diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, BPD dissociative disorder, complex PTSD, and had a history of domestic violence and battery charges as well as past addictions. She had a couple of kids, and part of our program involved helping parents relearn how to interact with their children, focusing on positive parenting techniques. Being fresh out of my master's program, I'll admit I was in way over my head. One of her kids was essentially the channeler in the family, taking on all the anger, sadness, and rage from the mom and projecting it outward. We tried to work with the mom on communicating differently, encouraging her to avoid yelling and using physical restraint, but she really struggled with the concept. She was actively involved in trauma therapy, but processing her own pain was still a massive challenge. One day we were out on a walk when, without any warning, the mom suddenly body slammed that kid onto the concrete floor. The child was only about 6 years old and just looked terrified and heartbroken. I remember standing there absolutely stunned with my colleague beside me. In that moment, I couldn't help but judge. It wasn't professional, but seeing such a small, vulnerable child treated like that just broke something in me. Story 39. I'm not a therapist, but I've had my share of really bad ones, especially after I was raped. After my mom found out about the assault, she admitted me to a mental hospital without my consent. During my stay, a psychiatrist there told me, "You need to get better about saying no." He didn't even know what had happened. No one did, because I wasn't ready to share the details yet. He just assumed and blamed me without knowing a thing. After being discharged, they recommended another therapist who was just as awful. She told me I was lucky not to have gotten pregnant or contracted an STD, but the way she said it made it sound like she was shaming me for my past. On top of that, she was very into holistic, unscientific approaches and insisted that I shouldn't be on antidepressants, even though I desperately needed them at the time. I begged my dad to find a different therapist, but he insisted I stick it out for 6 sessions, which I hated every minute of. After that, I didn't see another therapist for 3 years. Even now with my current therapist, who is actually wonderful, I still feel uncomfortable discussing my assault and soul history. Those early experiences really damaged my ability to trust professionals in the mental health field. Story 40. I'm a psychologist, and while I make a conscious effort not to judge my clients, I'm still human, and there have been a few moments where I couldn't help it. One instance was early in my career when I was working with a client who had a lot of personality issues and a tumultuous marriage filled with infidelity on both sides. We were talking about how these marital problems affected him when he suddenly revealed that he had a threesome with his wife and his brother as payment for a loan his brother had given him. I tried to control my reaction, but I'm sure my face gave me away. He ended up pushing therapeutic boundaries after that, and eventually I had to terminate and refer him to someone else. Not long after that, I was working with another client who was struggling with self-esteem issues. Out of nowhere, he mentioned that he and his wife also had a threesome with his brother. I think I managed my reaction better that time, but internally I was screaming, "What the hell is going on?" Two clients in the same month with the same bizarre family dynamic? It left me questioning how common this kind of situation actually was. Later, I worked in a prison for a while, and after seeing the extremes of human behavior there, I don't think much could make me say WTF anymore. Still, those early sessions left a lasting impression on me. Story 41. As a patient, one of the most validating moments in therapy came when my therapist simply said, "Okay, that's really messed up," after hearing about something my mother did. It was the first time someone acknowledged that the way she treated me was not normal, and I didn't have to feel guilty for thinking that. Realizing that it's okay to acknowledge that my mother is a messed up person was a turning point for me. I didn't have to feel like a bad person for recognizing the truth. One of the instances that really caught my counselor off guard was a text my mom sent me. It was a quote about how, "One day you were my little one, and now you have little ones of your own," along with some other flowery nonsense. Confused, I checked with my sister, and she had received the same text. The weird part? Neither of us has kids. I Googled the quote and found it on a list of 30 Mother's Day quotes. She had just copied a random quote without even thinking if it applied to us. Honestly, having my therapist react with, "Wow, that's messed up," was one of the most healing things they could have done. It validated that I wasn't crazy for feeling hurt and confused. Story 42. While I was in my graduate program, we had a class where the professor asked us to reflect on our personal values and share if there were any clients we would be uncomfortable serving. One classmate openly said they would be uncomfortable working with gay people because they found them disgusting. Another student said her religious beliefs wouldn't allow her to support someone considering an abortion. The professor acknowledged their honesty and reminded them of the NAF Code of Ethics. He emphasized that while they had the right to their personal beliefs, they also needed to recognize that holding such biases might make them unfit to serve certain clients. Fast forward a year to my internship, and I was assigned a client who had refused therapy from every other therapist at the agency. I was told I would be a perfect fit, but not given any further context. When I finally met the client, it became clear she was a white supremacist, and I was the only white therapist left. All the others she had rejected were Latino or African American. After the session, I met with my supervisor and expressed that I couldn't work with the client because her ideology went against my core values. I thought they would appreciate my honesty, as my professor had encouraged. Instead, I faced significant pushback and was told I had to work with her for the sake of my learning and growth. I had no choice if I wanted to complete my internship in hours. It was an incredibly traumatic experience that lasted an entire year. Story 43. I'm not a therapist, but my son almost became a victim of a bad one. Depression runs in our family, and my son started struggling with it in his teenage years. We found a great therapist who prescribed medication that truly helped him. But when the therapist stopped accepting our insurance, we had to find someone new. The insurance recommended a different therapist, so we gave him a try. Right from the start, I had a bad feeling. He had a nasty cold and wiped his nose with his hand before trying to shake mine. I declined. Then during the session, he asked my son bizarrely vague questions like, "Are you sometimes happy and other times sad?" After I mentioned that my uncle was bipolar, he immediately diagnosed my son as bipolar as well and recommended heavy-duty drugs, Thorazine and Elavil. I insisted that we just needed a refill on the medication that had been working, but he cut me off, saying I wasn't a therapist and didn't know my son as well as he did. He outright refused to prescribe the existing medication, even though it was helping. This whole assessment took about 10 minutes. We left, and I immediately filed a formal complaint with the insurance company. Thankfully, they referred us to a more competent therapist who continued the original medication plan.